correspondent with The Guardian, and in which he covered a number of topics, including the Watergate scandal in the U.S. In the late 1990s, he took his talents to writing nonfiction and has produced over a dozen nonfiction books, including Krakatoa, and the books, or the book he will talk to us about tonight. He's also written extensively for Harper's, National Geographic, the New York Times, the Atlantic Monthly, and the Daily Telegraph. So obviously a widely accomplished writer that many of you have probably seen in print as you do your own personal reading. It says that he has a number of hobbies, including beekeeping, astronomy, model railways, and cider making. That certainly is a diversity of endeavors that would make us all curious. And tonight he's going to talk about his new book and presumably read some passages from it. A book which covers a variety of topics. The Atlantic, that's the overarching umbrella of this book, but great sea battles, historic discoveries, titanic storms, a vast ocean of a million stories. Presumably there's something in there about climate change. But I give you Simon Winchester.
Well, thank you. I think I've turned this on. Does it all
Yes.
I have. Good, excellent. Well, thank you for that. The story of how I got from geology to journalism is actually an extraordinary story, and if anyone wants to hear it after I've waffled on about the Atlantic, I'd be delighted to tell you it's very much off message. So, from tell you some stories, which I hope you'll find vaguely amusing. This book, although it's about the Atlantic Ocean, was essentially born out of a failure of an earlier book that I wrote about 20 years ago, which was about the Pacific Ocean. I was living in Hong Kong at the time, and everyone in Hong Kong said, "Oh, Simon, the Pacific is the ocean of the future, and you should write a book about it." Just as Robert Kaplan has now written a book about the Indian Ocean, because people have been saying to him much the same thing: the Indian Ocean is the ocean of the future. So I spent about 2 years wandering about all over the Pacific Ocean, from Kamchatka to Chile, and from Australia to Alaska and all the islands in between, and wrote a book which came out in about 1990, and was a dismal commercial failure. And mind you, I do know commercial failure, because in 1976 I wrote a book about this country, about the Midwest of the United States, which sold precisely 12 copies. So, although unbelievably, a woman today called, I forget her name, but anyway, she's a student at NYU, wrote to me. She's doing a thesis on something to do with the United States, and had this book recommended to her. I said, could I by any chance find? She found it very difficult to find, and I said, well, I have hundreds. So I sent her one this afternoon. It's weird, but anyway, we were trying to analyze why this book was not a commercial success. I think it could have been because it was badly written or whatever, but I think we realized in short order that the principal problem was that although the Pacific may well be the ocean of the future, whatever that actually means, what it really wasn't. It wasn't the ocean of the past, at least as far as humankind was concerned. Yes, there was Captain Cook, and yes, there was Magellan, of course, and yes, there were the Polynesian navigations, but basically there wasn't a huge amount of human history connected to the Pacific Ocean, whereas two other bodies of water on this planet were hugely, very significantly connected to humankind. The first is obviously the Mediterranean, which I think one can say in shorthand is the inland sea of classical civilization. And if you believe that, which I did after a little bit of thought, then it's not much of an intellectual leap to think that the Atlantic Ocean next door is quite probably the inland sea of modern Western civilization. And so I decided when I was sort of licking my wounds in the early 1990s, that looking back on the Pacific book, that what I'd done was clearly backed the wrong horse, as it were. And that sooner or later, I suppose that's a metaphor I can use in Millbrook more than most places in the world, that sooner or later I should write a book about the ocean that really had a lot of history to it, human history, and that was the Atlantic. Well, and so that was sort of a guiding thought through the 90s and the early 2000s, but other books came and went, and I wrote those. But then there came a sort of trigger point, and also by chance it was on the Pacific again. I was in Chile, in the very far south of Chile, driving on a road that maybe some of you have driven on, a very bad road that goes from Punta Arenas in southern Patagonia to the Torres del Paine National Park, beautiful, beautiful mountains. And it's a pretty dreadful road, as many of you, those of you that travel on it may remember. It's very windy, it's gravel, there are sort of precipitous cliffs, you can fall off quite easily. There are very few habitations, and on this particular night it was raining cats and dogs, a big thunderstorm. I was very tired, so I thought I ought to look for a hotel. The only places to stay, but there was a slightly promising sign off to the left, pointing down a presumably even worse dirt road, which said Hosteria del Rio de la Penitencia, which didn't, I must say, look desperately promising, but I nonetheless turned down this road and bumped down what was little more than a cart track, to be confronted at the end by an enormous sort of baronial Scottish castle with one or two lights showing rather dimly, and I hammered on the door in this rainstorm. It was sort of a Frankenstein moment. And the door was opened by a functionary, and he said, "Oh yes, we are a hotel indeed, and we haven't had a guest for the last 6 or 7 months, I don't think, but you're more than welcome. Do please come in." And he explained it had been built, this place, by a Scotsman in the 1880s, and it had been a sheep farm. And they no longer farm sheep, but they farmed the Patagonian equivalent of the llama, which is this animal called a guanaco, and there were lots of guanacos around, and indeed he had one in the fridge. He said that guanacos are very tasty, and that he could whip up a casserole of guanaco for me, and I said, that sounds absolutely wonderful. So, half an hour later, I was eating this very rich casserole of guanaco and freshly baked bread and a bottle of Malbec, and I thought all was, God was in heaven and all was right with the world. And then he showed me into this magnificent library, a huge sort of baronial library with a great inglenook fireplace and a fire which he had lit. And there was a bottle of whiskey, and there was a library of books, nearly all of them in English. And he said, just make yourself at home and read. And so I, fairly carefully, I selected a volume, and I read it, and I was so captivated by the story in this book of about 200 pages that I read it right through to the end, and when I finished it, dawn was coming up over the Andes. So this book completely captivated me, and I'll tell you more about the book towards the end, but suffice to say that it was a book about the Atlantic Ocean, read on the shores of the Pacific, but it made me think now is the moment to get to grips with this story that I wanted to do for the last 20 years. I will now write a book about the Atlantic, and I so wrote to the publishers, and they said, well, what sort of structure? Because how on earth do you write a book about an ocean as gigantic and as complicated as the Atlantic? Well, my first thought was that I should, because without anthropomorphizing it too much, it is possible to regard the Atlantic as a living thing, in that it moves, it makes noises, it has moods, it can be doleful or vengeful or arrogant or whatever. And it also has a definite and provable moment of birth. We know when the Atlantic was born, which was about 195 million years ago. And we also know, with a fair degree of precision, we think anyway, at least geological futurists who are mathematicians largely based at the University of Texas, and who have worked out how continents have moved in the past and how they believe they'll move in the future. They think the Atlantic will cease to be in about 170 million more years. What will happen is that it sounds rather bizarre, but if you can imagine the map Cape Horn at the southern tip, not far away from where I had my epiphany, but Cape Horn will start to move eastwards along the, as it were, the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, will pass south of Cape Agulhas and Cape of Good Hope, will continue moving eastward along the bottom of the Indian Ocean, and then when it reaches Australia, specifically Tasmania, it will set Australia spinning extremely slowly, of course, anti-clockwise, and then Cape Horn will start moving north and eventually collide with Singapore. So if you can imagine this rather bizarre scenario in 170 million years' time, then the last bit of water will be squeezed out between Africa and South America, between Europe and North America, and the Atlantic will cease to be. The water will go somewhere else, because there's always a finite amount of water on the planet, but the 34 million square miles, this S-shaped entity that we know and love as the Atlantic, will cease to be. And I should make a point here about the concept of geologic time, because not everyone is entirely comfortable with these vast expanses of time. I was giving a talk a few years ago in Kansas City to a group of ladies who lunch about the Yellowstone volcanic complex in Montana, and how it will, before long, erupt in a titanic series of explosions, the same explosions that created it in the first place. And when these eruptions occur, and they'll last for many hundreds of years, all of the major cities of the northwestern United States and western Canada, so Calgary and Vancouver and Portland and Seattle and San Francisco, will be buried in hundreds of feet of volcanic dust, and that'll be the end. The whole of northwestern America will, I said, be toast. And there was sort of alarm from these ladies, and I said, "But no need to worry about this, because we're talking about 250,000 years' time, I mean, geological timescale, by which time, of course, all humankind will be extinct." And everyone sort of breathed a sigh of sort of corporate relief, except for one woman in the front row who waved her program, stood up, angry, red-faced. She'd lunched rather well, I think, and said, "What?" She said, "What? You mean even Americans will be extinct?" So I said, yes, they will be when Yellowstone erupts, and they will be when the Atlantic comes to an end. So, born when Pangaea splits up 195 million years ago, will die in 170 odd million years. That's a total lifespan of about 360 million years, which provides at least the basic framework for what I found initially to write, which was a biography. It has a birth, it has a life, it has a death. Biography seems the obvious thing to do. However, what that doesn't take into account is the heart of the book, the kernel, the nut, or whatever you might call it, which is the comparatively narrow sliver of time, about 200,000 years, say, when humankind resides in and around the ocean. And that is so full of complexity, it's simply not amenable to the same biographical, chronological structure. So I had to think of another way of doing that. I could have a biographical meta-structure. I could have, the proscenium arch, if you like, could be biographical, but the internals of the book had to be something different. And I was sitting one day on a plane crossing the Atlantic on the milk run from London to New York, I think it was. And I don't know if you have the same experience as I do, but I mean, your companion is tedious, the food is dreadful, you're bored with the magazine or something, and you look at that little screen in front of you and your aircraft is moving with infinitesimal slowness across it. And no matter when you look up, you are always somewhere over the Atlantic between Greenland and Newfoundland. And it just won't move. You don't get any, and you look out of the window and it's just grey, it's clouds, and the Atlantic Ocean, I mean, forget the idea that it may be full of romance and daring do and history and all this kind of stuff. It's just an incommoding mass of distance. That's what it's been rendered to. The pond is merely distance. And at that moment, I picked up a book just to stop myself being further bored. And it was a book I often carry with me, but I saw it suddenly in a new light. It was a book of poetry, an anthology compiled by the former British Foreign Secretary, a man called David Owen, now Lord Owen, and it was called 7 Ages. And he had organised all the poetry that he had come to love during his life according to the 7 ages of man from Shakespeare's As You Like It. You remember all the world's a stage, and all the men and women in the players, they have their exits and their entrances. One man in his time plays many parts, the number of acts being 7 ages. And those 7 ages begins with the infant mewling and puking in his nurse's arms, the schoolboy, whining schoolboy with shining horny face creeping unwillingly like snail to school. The 7 ages are, there's infant, there's schoolboy or schoolchild, lover, soldier, justice, old man, and return to childhood. And it suddenly seemed to me, sitting on that plane that day, that I could corral all of the information I was beginning to gather, all the knowledge, all the stories, all the anecdotes about the Atlantic, according to these 7 ages of man. So, for instance, into the soldier chapter, I could corral everything to do with warfare and bellicosity and man's unpleasantness. So it could be everything from the Vikings, the Roman invasions, the Merrimack and the Monitor, the Battle of Trafalgar, the Battle of Jutland, the Falklands War that I was rather intimately involved with, and also slavery and piracy and all this kind of thing. That could all go into the soldier chapter. The lover chapter, for instance, that could be our romantic involvement with the ocean. It could be everything from the early Celtic and Anglo-Saxon poetry. It could look at architecture, how it evolved. It could look at painting from Dürer, one of the very first to depict the Atlantic, right through to J.W. Turner and to Winslow Holmes and people like that. It could look at song. It could look at music, Debussy and Beethoven and Mendelssohn, who wrote so much about the Atlantic Ocean. So each one of those chapters, each one of those 7 ages, could give me the internal structure of the book. And thus far, the New York Times review for this book is on the 12th of December, so I await that with some biting my nails. But thus far, no critic has said, what an appalling idea to use Shakespeare. Shakespeare never saw the Atlantic Ocean. He never went on a ship, as far as we know. He was a completely non-maritime kind of chap. And yet, however cheeky it was, the idea of using the 7 ages thus far, it seems to have worked. So, or at least I've dodged the bullet from the critics thus far. So what I thought I'd do is to, having described the structure of the book, is just to prize from this great mass of stories. And I might tell you, incidentally, the subtitle of this book, this may show an insight into one aspect of modern-day publishing. When I wrote this book, it was to be called Atlantic, the Biography of an Ocean. Seems to me a perfectly respectable title. Everyone thought so, my editor, my agent, everybody, and the English people too. The one group that did not was Barnes & Noble. And Barnes & Noble said the word biography is simply too complicated for our browsing public. You've got to change it into something much more sexy. So, working with my editor, he said, look, this is painful, we'll have to do it. So great sea battles, heroic discoveries. I mean, everything about this, I winced. And indeed, the English editor said, I'm simply not going to, because it's too American. So he called it Atlantic, a vast ocean of a million stories. But the Americans have gone with that, and thus far the book seems to be doing all right. So I'm afraid, I hate to admit it, but I think Barnes & Noble probably had a point. And if it was simply called Atlantic Biography of an Ocean, who knows what it would be doing. But anyway, what I thought from these 1 million stories, I'll just take 3 to give you some vague idea of the kind of sort of anecdotal richness that I was able to find in this extraordinary ocean. I tried to choose the 3 with some sort of geographical spread. So the first is from the North Atlantic, the second is from the more or less, well, maybe latitude 40 or so in the North Atlantic, and then the last one is in the South Atlantic. And the first story is absolutely no point to it at all. It's just something that I discovered, which I thought was extraordinary, rather amazing. The second story has got a lot of importance to it. It may be a surprise to you, maybe some of you know it, but I didn't. I was surprised by it. And the third is completely ludicrous. And then after I've told you those 3, I'll get back to the book that I discovered in Chile. So the first story. The first story occurs in the Faroe Islands, one of the islands I had to go to for the research. The Faroes, if you don't know, are a group of 18 small islands in the far North Atlantic, about 62 degrees north, between the Shetland Islands and Iceland. And they're cold and they're foggy and they rain a lot and you have tremendous storms, and consequently it's a place that the English love to go on holiday. But the only tourists who ever go to the Faroes are us, basically. So there are 18 islands and they are under the sovereignty of Denmark. There's a Danish governor, but they have self-rule. And the 50,000 people that live there are, to all intents and purposes, Vikings. They're the last sort of relics of the pure Viking people, genetically. The language they speak, Faroese, is essentially the last linguistic relic of the Vikings. Well, you all know the reputation of the Vikings. I mean, they were hardwired to pillage and to sack and to rape and do all sorts of unpleasant things. The trouble with the Faroes today is that these 25,000 Viking men there is that they're at war with nobody. And so these people have, consequently, they're very big physically, the men, and they have evidently a superabundance of testosterone and no way to purge themselves of it, except by this technique that I'm about to tell you about, which I discovered. The islands are made of basalt, sort of the same volcanic rock that Iceland and East Greenland is made of, but they're different in one respect in that they're tilted to the east about 30 degrees, and the result of this is that all 18 of the Faroese Islands have enormous cliffs on their western side, about some of them 2,000 feet high, and some of the tallest cliffs in the world, absolutely sheer, black, cascading with water. And then the top of the island, the grass slopes down about 30 degrees until it bleeds into the east with cliff-less shores. So what happens on these cliffs. If you look at the cliffs carefully, you'll see that dotted along any of them are little patches of grass, I should say about 5 times as big as this podium here. So not very big, but you'll see them, green patches. They're vertiginously steep. I mean, they're as steep as the cliffs almost, so maybe 80 degrees from the horizontal. And it is on those patches of grass that this little drama is played out. Because each springtime, young Faroese men, these Viking chaps, needing to purge themselves of all this surplus testosterone, come to the base of the cliffs with the intention of climbing up them. Now, this is something they do every year and for a very specific purpose. And to help them with this, they have set fixed ropes, which there are big stanchions at the very top of the cliffs and ropes suspended all the way down to the sea. Maybe the island that I first saw this on was an island called Mykonos, which is the westernmost of the Faroe Islands. And the cliff face is maybe 2 miles long, and about every 200 yards there's a rope. So if you can imagine the scene, the sea is invariably incredibly rough, it's very cold, but a young man standing in the prow of a boat with his colleague steering it from the back will approach the cliff, and the water was crashing up and down. It's very dangerous. The bottom of the cliff white with foam and with slippery with eelgrass and seaweed. It's a very, to even imagine getting on it, it's going to be a very difficult thing to suppose. But he's very practiced, is this chap, and he's a Viking, of course. So he positions himself opposite one of these ropes and waits until the moment is right and the boat's going up and down, and suddenly leaps over the stretch of water and grabs onto the rope, and there's all sorts of cursing and splashing and skin knees and things, but invariably, because he's done it before, he's secure, he's okay. He holds on and he puts in his knee and foot on a foothold, and he's secure. So he's about to begin his climb to the top. But before he does so, he reaches, he secures himself, puts one hand on the rope, reaches down into the well of the boat, and from the well of the boat, he plucks a lamb. Because there are lots of lambs in the bottom of the boat. And he arranges this lamb around his neck. He sort of secures himself, and he puts the lamb with its paws, or whatever lambs has, down the front of his shirt, and maybe lifts up his collar. But anyway, he gets the lamb securely round his neck. Once he knows the lamb's secure, he then begins climbing. So hand over hand over hand. And up he goes, quite fast, 200 feet, 400 feet, 600 feet, way up into the clouds. until maybe 800,000 feet up, he finds one of these patches of this vertical grass. Now, the thing about the grass on these cliffs is that they are fertilized by the guano from the seabirds that inhabit the cliffs, so the guillemots and kittiwakes and shearwaters and things, but most crucially of all, the bird which is most numerous in the Faroes, which is the puffin. And puffins, as perhaps many of you know, their guano is extremely rich in nitrates, which makes the grass incredibly lush and thick and nourishing. The only inconvenience is that it's nearly 80 degrees from the horizontal, so we're not talking pastures here, we're talking... But nonetheless, this does not deter our Viking, who, when he gets opposite one of these patches of rich but vertical grass, he takes the lamb off his neck and puts it on the grass. And of course, I don't know whether lambs experience terror when they look down, see hundreds of feet below them, crashing water and all the rest of it. But the lamb is a pretty intelligent beast, apparently, and realizes that if he's not going to plummet to his death, he better arrange his legs in a way that will keep him secure. And so a sort of weird sort of dance goes on with the Faroese man with his hand on the outside of the lamb, encouraging it, and the lamb scrabbling for safety and security. And then after 4 or 5 minutes, in the conversation, I don't know what language it takes, Viking or lamb or whatever he speaks, but he says to him eventually, "Do you think you're going to be okay?" And the little beast gives a sort of hoof up, something, and he removes his hand very gently, and the lamb remains where he is. And he takes his hand away, and he goes back down the rope and joins his friend in the boat below. So if you look at any Faroese cliff in the summertime, from about April or March till September, October, you will see repeated in every island the great black expanse of cliff, a little green patch of grass, and in the middle of it, a tiny white dot. And if you look through binoculars, it will be a lamb, because it will be terrified out of its wits, but clinging on for grim death and nibbling away the grass around it. So, come September, the reverse of what happened in spring occurs, which is that the Faroese man comes back, finds his rope, jumps on, climbs up 800, 900 feet to his original patch of grass, where he discovers there is no longer a lamb there, but an enormous sheep, because the creatures had nothing to do for the entire year but eat puffin, guano-enriched grass and stay absolutely dead still for fear of what would happen if it started moving around. So no gambling or whatever sheep do, just eating, wolfing down food and getting hugely obese as a consequence. Well, I would like to report that the Faroese man is compassionate in such matters, and I hope there's no one from PETA here. He should, I suppose, take this creature and put it around his neck and climb down, but he finds this a somewhat difficult thing to do. So, in fact, what he does is instead of putting his hand on the outside of the lamb, he puts it on the inside of the sheep between the cliff wall and the sheep, and with a practiced move, jerks backwards, and the sheep falls, tumbling end over end, with an enormous splash, lands in the sea. It is none too well as a consequence. And apparently, I know it sounds a sort of Monty Python-esque scene, if you remember the sketch about the prospects for ovine aviation. Well, it is very difficult and dangerous being in the waters below the cliffs of the Faroes in September, October, because of the risk of falling sheep. Anyway, our man gets down to his boat, pulls the stunned or worse sheep in. It floats for a long time because of all the lanolin in the wool, pulls it into his craft, and then takes it back to Torshavn, where they butcher it and have dinner of what they say is the most luscious, delicious sheep anywhere on this planet. So there's the story. It has no point to it at all. It's an indication of the kind of thing that I was fortunate enough to discover during the research. The second story, happens to change your mood utterly, is sort of important. And as I say, some of you may know this story. There's a bit of background information you need to have, which is that in 1916, the British, the Royal Navy, were losing the Battle of the Atlantic. There were two battles of the Atlantic, one in each of the great world wars of the last century, and both were what known as tonnage wars, where German submarines would attempt to interdict and sink eastbound cargo ships that were bringing supplies, food, medicine, or whatever, to Britain, basically, from either Canada or the United States. The technical difference between the two battles of the Atlantic, which in the First, or rather in the Second World War, the Germans, the U-boats, could fire their torpedoes at the cargo ships while they were submerged, which obviously made them rather difficult to find. But in the First World War, this was not the case. The technology wasn't advanced enough, and the German submarine would find a cargo ship with its periscope and then would ascend to the surface and attempt to fire its torpedoes. But this, of course, made him vulnerable to being shot at by the destroyers or the frigates or the corvettes that the Royal Navy was using to accompany the convoy. And the attrition rate on the German submarines was extremely high because they were sitting ducks, quite literally. That changed, however, very dramatically in the summer of 1916. Suddenly, the Royal Navy guns were unable to fire at the German ships for the simple reason that they were running short of cordite, which is the propellant needed to fire the shell from the 7 or 8 or 9-inch guns that they used. And the reason that they were running short of cordite was that they had run out of a crucial chemical component of cordite, the chemical acetone, which many women in the audience will know as nail polish remover. Up to that point, the British had bought all their supplies of acetone from Germany, but clearly Germany wasn't going to sell acetone to us if all we were going to do was turn it into cordite to shoot their submarines. So this was the problem we had, and that's the background. Now, in Manchester, every Tuesday, the editor of the Manchester Guardian, which is the paper that I used to work for, and he was a chap called C.P. Scott, Charles Prestwich Scott, a figure much revered among journalists because he came up with the edict that comment is free, but facts are sacred. C.P. Scott would have lunch at the Northern Liberal Club with someone that he found interesting. And in late August 1916, the person that he decided was interesting was the then professor of biology at the University of Manchester, who was a White Russian emigre called Chaim Weizmann. So Weizmann came to the Liberal Club, and Scott and Weizmann had a lengthy conversation, at the end of which Weizmann said, "Oh, by the way, Mr. Scott, you should know that in my laboratory in Manchester, I've just developed a technique for producing acetone in very large quantities." Now, Scott had no interest in acetone, never heard the word acetone in his life, but nonetheless remembered what had been said to him, which was just as well, because the following week he was in London having lunch with David Lloyd George, who was the Minister of Munitions in the British wartime cabinet. And Lloyd George told him the story that I've just told you about how our guns were unable to fire because we were running short of cordite because we'd run out of acetone. And a light went on in Scott's head. And he said, "Well, this is quite remarkable. I had lunch last Tuesday with this funny little fellow up in Manchester, a fellow called Weizmann, who tells me he can produce this stuff in huge quantities." And this, of course, set Lloyd George on fire. He said, "Really? I mean, did he seem sane?" He said, "Oh, he seemed a very nice man, very clever, off-finish up. Well, we should have him down to London to investigate him." So they summoned him down to London, and some civil servants saw him and discovered that he was indeed not a nutcase, and asked him, "Well, what do you need?" And he said, "Well, I need two things. First of all, I need a large sort of industrial plant with hoppers and vats and distilling equipment or something like that." And they said, "Well, the Nicholson's gin factory in Bow in East London has just gone bankrupt, and we've taken charge of the site. So would that be any good?" It's a gin factory. It's exactly what I need. I love a gin factory. So, fine, you can have that. And what else? Well, I need a large quantity of something with cellulose in it. So maize, perhaps. And they said, "We can't have maize because that all comes from America and Canada, and it keeps getting torpedoed, and that's the problem. We're running short of that because of the U-boats." Well, he said, "How about chestnuts?" And suddenly that seemed to make awfully good sense, because Some of you may know that in Britain, in the autumn, English schoolboys are programmed from birth to collect chestnuts, to play a game called conkers, exactly. And I won't go into the arcane rules of conkers, but basically you pick up a horse chestnut, borrowing or stealing a skewer from your mother, you drill a hole in it, you suspend it from a string like a plumb bob. Another nasty little boy armed with a similar weapon will attempt to hit yours while suspended. There are all sorts of very complicated rules, much cheating, largely involving roasting the conker in your mother's oven to make it brick hard. Anyway, the fact is that children, September and October in Britain, they know exactly what to do. They go out foraging and collect chestnuts. So the word went out from London this year that indeed children should be encouraged to collect chestnuts, but should not play conkers with them, should give them to their mothers. And so thousands of somewhat puzzled children collected conkers and gave them to their mothers, and lorries would come to the various villages and ends of street corners and things and put them into sacks, and they were brought down to London. They converged on the Nicholson's gin factory, poured into the hoppers and the stills and things, and using Weizmann's magic, first a few drops, then a trickle, then a gush, then a positive torrent of pure acetone poured out of the spigots, was put into carboys, put onto trains, taken down to the Royal Navy Ordnance Factory at Poole in Dorset, made into cordite, which was loaded onto the ships. The guns, come November 1916, started firing again, and the whole calculus of the war changed, such that by March and April 1917, far from losing the Battle of the Atlantic, it was abundantly clear that the British were now winning the Battle of the Atlantic. Everything had changed, and to our advantage. So come the early summer, the somewhat self-satisfied British war planners said, gosh, we're awfully grateful to this funny little fellow up in Manchester, Weizmann. We must give him something, a present, or something. We must honour him. And of course the British are unimaginative about these things. They said, well, the obvious thing to do is to give him a knighthood. And there were these discussions, Sir Haim Weizmann. It's got a rather nice ring to it. Yes, I'm sure he'd like that. But the only problem was that Haim Weizmann was not British. He couldn't therefore be given one, except in an honorary capacity, and the person that would do that would be the Foreign Secretary, who was Arthur Balfour. And so Balfour was told, he knew Weizmann somewhat socially, so he said, oh, I'd love to do that. So he summoned Weizmann down from Manchester, and saw him in the great, the ambassador's waiting room in the Foreign Office, and said, Professor Weizmann, I'm authorised on behalf of the government to announce our tremendous gratitude to you for this great breakthrough in chemistry, and I'd like to offer you a knighthood, an honorary knighthood. You can be Sir Haim Weizmann. And Weizmann said, well, that's awfully nice of you, Mr. Balfour, but I actually decline. I didn't want no honour for myself, but as you know, I'm Secretary of the English League of Zionists. And what I would like from you, instead of an honour, is a formal declaration that you would look, your government would look with favour on the establishment of a homeland for the Jewish people in Palestine. And Weizmann, Arthur Balfour said, well, I think that sounds a jolly good idea. We can talk about that. So throughout the summer, the British government discussed this with allies and all sorts of implications of this thing. And then on the 17th of November 1917, a formal declaration was made, the famous Balfour Declaration, that His Majesty's government looks with favour upon the establishment of a homeland for the Jewish people in Palestine. And that was given formally to the President of the World Zionist Federation, Lord Rothschild, but with a copy out of gratitude to the man who started it all, Haim Weizmann. So 31 years later, the State of Israel was born as a direct consequence of the writing of the Balfour Declaration, and one can therefore fairly say that Israel was born on the basis of a quirk of chemistry and a want of the chemical acetone in the North Atlantic. So I found it, thank you very much, I found it an amazing story, and it all checks out. The Israeli Foreign Ministry and everyone has said it's absolutely kosher. So the final story is just completely ludicrous. I mean, more ludicrous than the thing about the sheep. But it does allow me to come down into the southern waters, and it all concerns an island called Tristan da Cunha. Tristan da Cunha is a British territory. It's the most isolated inhabited island in the world. It's 1,800 miles due west of Cape Town, and it is a volcano, a dangerous volcano. And the population, there are 250 people there that belong to 7 families, and they don't do very much, but what they do, they do with each other, and the genetic consequences of that are plain for everyone to see. They do a little bit of fishing, and they grow potatoes, but they love their life. Indeed, when in the 1960s the volcano erupted and the entire population had to be evacuated, and they were brought to a British Army base near Southampton in England, they stayed there for a year, and they then declared very politely that they absolutely hated it. They didn't like the motor cars, and they didn't like elevators and the bustle of life, and they all voted to go back and resume their simple, contented way of life. And they've lived there ever since. There's very little emigration from Tristan, and they don't allow any immigration. So 7 families and 250 people, totally stable, totally happy. Somewhat boring, I must say, to people that go there. Well, in 1941, the British government, for reasons best known to itself, reclassified the island of Tristan da Cunha as a ship. They took away its name, and they decided it should be called HMS Atlantic Isle. And its job, and I don't want you to think I'm obsessed with U-boats, but its job was to be a static Royal Naval ship to be used as an observation platform for German submarine activity in the South Atlantic. And they dismissed the colonial governor of the administration, and in their place sent down 6 sailors to run the ship. 5 ratings, and the commanding officer, who was a young lieutenant called Derek Boy, spelled B-O-O-Y. And Derek Boy, who remained there for 6 years, or 5 years actually, he was evacuated in 1946, was a highly intelligent, very sensitive, and very literate man. And he wrote the most exquisite book in, I think, 1954, which I read. And the thing that was central, the thing that most fascinated me, was that he fell in love with one of the island girls. She was called Emily Rogers. And it is probably the most chaste love affair you can ever imagine reading about. He describes one moment where he extended his hand towards her, and he thinks she was going to shake it, and he thought the brush of her fingers against his, but he couldn't be entirely certain that that's what had happened. And then about 2 years later he said, "Hello." He thought he heard her say something back, but the wind whipped her rather quiet voice away, so he couldn't be absolutely certain. But what did make him 100% sure that she reciprocated this passion he felt for her was on the day they left, which was in March 1946. A Royal Navy warship came to pick up the 6 sailors, and the ship was reclassified as an island again. And all the island women were lined up on the beach to say goodbye to the departing rowing boats that were taking them away. And he writes that the youngsters were sitting on chairs at the seaside, and older women behind them standing. And he said that through the spume and the spray, one young woman on the right-hand side, they all looked identical because their heads were covered by shawls, but she dipped her head down, and an older woman put a comforting hand on her shoulder. And this was confirmation for him that this was Emily, and that she therefore loved him with an unyielding passion. So he went back to England and wrote this wonderful book in 1954, in which the description of his farewell, it affected me, and I remembered it, and I tried to get in touch with him, and in fact he had died a long time before. So I went to Tristan for the first time in 1984 or 85, I think. And one of the things I wanted to do was to find Emily and talk about what she remembered of this visit of the sailors. So I went to see the little town that's called Edinburgh of the Seven Seas, and I interviewed people there. And then by now Emily was in her 50s and was married to the chief islander, a man called Mr. Glass. So she's now Emily Glass. And I was shown where his house was, and I walked up to it, and there was Mr. Glass standing with his arms folded behind his garden gate. And he said, quite brusquely to me, I understand you're a writer. And I said, yes. And he said, well, I know why you've come. You'll want to see our Emily. And I said, well, I was rather hoping to, yes. He said, no, you absolutely can't. And I said, why is she unwell? No. That disgraceful book that was written by Mr. Boy. I said, it wasn't disgraceful at all. It was lyrical. It was good. No, it was disgusting. It was embarrassing, and we don't want to be reminded of it, so shoot, go away, go away. So I didn't want to anger this chap, so I indeed did leave, and eventually went back to London and wrote a book. It was a book about all the remaining possessions of the British government, of which there were at the time 16, 15 now that Hong Kong is gone. And there was indeed a slim chapter on Tristan da Cunha, and buried deep within the chapter were 2 lines about saying goodbye and the dipped head and the comforting, and that was it. So, and I thought nothing would eventuate from this. However, I was entirely wrong. Must have been 1997, 1998, I was back in the South Atlantic on a small cruise ship, lecturing to a party of American explorers who were about the islands of the South Atlantic. So I was talking about the Falkland Islands, the South Georgia, South Shetland Islands, the Shag Rocks, and eventually Tristan da Cunha. And I remember this extraordinary day when I was lecturing fairly lyrically. You could see the volcano 20 miles or so ahead of us, very distinctive conical form. And I was in full flood talking about the Napoleonic Wars and the history of Tristan and the 7 families that had populated it and how Queen Victoria gave a piano and all the rest of it. And then timed it happily such that the moment the lecture was over, you don't drop anchor off Tristan, you tie up by some kelp beds and wait for a boat to come out to you. So anyway, I finished the lecture, everyone was eagerly anticipating going out. A little island boat came out to greet us, and I noticed with some alarm that standing in it was the very large form of the island's only policeman. He's also the doctor and the magistrate, and he wears several hats, but he had a hat which said Tristan Constabulary. So he came up the companionway onto the bridge and said, is there a Mr. Winchester on this boat? And I said, yes. And he said, I'm afraid you won't be able to land. And I said, why not? He said, because that's a disgusting book you read. By now, Emily was in her late 60s. Daring boy had long ago died. Anyway, it was embarrassing. All the Americans were going past me, and I'm saying, I'm sorry, I've lectured on this island, I'm not allowed on it. Well, that's so be it. And off they went, and they all came back a couple of hours later, bearing their souvenir potatoes and saying, well, you should sue them. The lawyers were all saying, sue them, freedom of speech. First time. Anyway, this happened twice more. In, I think, 2001 and 2003, I went, and I was still denied permission. So when I was doing research for this book, I thought I ought to ask before I departed, because it would save a little time and trouble. So now Tristan da Cunha has email, and at least the Colonial Administrator, it was a very nice man called David Morley, who I had known before because he had been in Islamabad in Pakistan, and I used to live in India and I used to go and see him. In all fairness, it cannot be said that he's a gentleman at the cutting edge of British diplomacy if his final posting as Administrator Tristan da Cunha. I didn't refer to this in my email to him. I said, David, it's been 25 years since I saw you in Islamabad, and I'd love to see you again. He replied with great excitement to his wife, and he would love to see me, and to come have tea or whatever. We talk about the good old days, the Khyber Pass, and so on. But he said, you do have a bit of a problem here, and I think your case, I had better put it to the Island Council. And about a month later came the reply that I was dreading, which was very terse, but very, very forceful. He said, I'm afraid this is not going to happen, Simon, but here's why. The Island Council met yesterday formally to discuss this question, and the ruling is that Mr. Simon Winchester will not be permitted to land on Tristan da Cunha on this occasion, or indeed ever. So, Emily Rogers is dead, her husband's dead. You would have thought the matter of... I'd completely purged my contempt, but they haven't, and so they didn't allow me on. But my wife came with me she was allowed to get on, although she didn't exactly wander around the island saying, "Guess who I am?" And she said from what she could gather, nothing had changed. But I do, in all honesty, truth in advertising and so forth, I want to say that though I have written a book which claims to be an authoritative and comprehensive account of the Atlantic Ocean, there is a lacuna in the very far south. I have not been able to visit Tristan da Cunha, lacuna, since 1985. I'm just going to finally now refer to the book that I read in Chile. It was a book by a man called John Marsh. It was called Skeleton Coast. And it was the account of a shipwreck which occurred in Namibia, or what was then Southwest Africa, in 1942. A ship called the Dunedin Star wrecked on something called the Clan Alpine Shoal, and it had 62 people on board. And if you wreck on the Skeleton Coast, you are likely to die because there is no water for approximately 300 miles from the Canene River on the Angolan frontier and Walvis Bay. It's just sand dunes and nothing else. It's very, very dangerous. And it's called the Skeleton Coast because it is littered with the wrecks of ships and whales and men who have died there. Well, extraordinarily, and that's what kept me so gripped that night in Chile, these 62 were rescued. They weren't rescued by sea, but they were rescued by land. There was a convoy of Land Rovers which came up from the capital, Windhoek. It took them 2.5 months. All the time they were being supplied, these people, with water dropped from bombers. So they kept from dying of thirst, and they were given some food as this convoy moved slowly, under incredible difficulty. But they got them, and all 62, including 2 babes in arms, were back happy and healthy 2.5 months later. It was an extraordinary story, but what really gripped me was the story of the attempts to rescue them by sea. All of them were abandoned, and one of the attempts involved a tug called the Sir Charles Elliot, which came up from Cape Town, and it was wrecked about 12 miles from where the Dunedin Star was wrecked. And 2 young men, one called Matthias Coruscant, who came from that part of Africa, and the other a Scotsman called Angus Campbell McIntyre, were drowned. Matthias Coruscant's body was found, but Angus Campbell McIntyre's body was never found. It was swept out to sea. So I vowed sort of there and then, sitting by this fire in Chile, that I would one day visit, see if I could find the wreck of the Dunedin Star. Well, when I was doing the research for this book, I found myself in Cape Town, got a flight to Windhoek, chartered a little aircraft which took me way up onto the Skeleton Coast, where I found a village and a man with a Land Rover who knew this the beach. And we went out onto the coast itself, and we drove north. I had the GPS position of where I believed the wreck to be, and indeed, after 3 days, extraordinary trying conditions, we found it. The boilers intact, the anchors, the chains, the funnel, the shelter that the people had built for themselves, and much of the cargo, huge boxes, wooden boxes, which when you prized them open, were full of still unbroken light bulbs. Extraordinary. There was nothing to check whether they worked or not. At least they were still unbroken. So I thought that was all moving and extraordinary. But what I really wanted to see was what must be the loneliest grave site in the world. And so I knew also where the Sir Charles Elliot had wrecked, about 12 miles south. So I went down off a place called Rocky Point. Sure enough, you have these huge waves coming in, and where they dip between the waves, you can occasionally see 2 little black stanchions, which are all that is visible ever above the surface of the water. The ship is all the rest of it is below. And opposite those 2 stanchions, I was told, is this grave. And sure enough, there it was, on a sand spit, a pile of stones and whale bones, and a brass plaque to the memory of Matthias Coruscant and Angus Campbell McIntyre, who died attempting to save men in the Dunedin Star wreck in November 1942. And I was incredibly moved by this, and hardly anyone goes there. There's this Scottish tradition that if you come across a cairn of boulders, you're duty-bound to add to it, to keep it sort of in structural integrity. And all I had was I found a little bottle up on the wreck site, a little glass bottle, worn smooth by the sand, with a little screw cap. that obviously I would have thought some woman had carried smelling salts or sal volatile or something in it. So all I could do, and it sounds awfully corny, was I tore a page from my notebook and I wrote, "Thanks for trying, now rest in peace." And I signed my name and I folded this piece of paper up, tucked it into the bottle, screwed it tightly shut, and placed it beneath some stones and some whale bones, and sort of bowed my head. And I thought, a message in a bottle, something after all sailors know all about. Because I thought that particularly the man whose body had not been found, Angus Campbell MacIntyre, he was born in the Atlantic Ocean, or at least on a Scottish island that was washed by the Atlantic. He travelled in search of his future down the Atlantic to take a job in Cape Town, a city essentially, a city which is architecturally very much a homage to the Atlantic Ocean. He took a job on a tugboat, which business was the Atlantic. He died in an attempt to save people in a wreck on the Atlantic, and his body was swept out and lies somewhere in the Atlantic. He seemed to symbolize at least part of our relationship with this great ocean. So I left the site and I went back to New York and I wrote the book. And when I was finishing that final story, I thought somehow even that note wasn't good enough. And what I ought to do, because he so symbolized everything, was to actually dedicate the book to him. And so the book is dedicated to my wife, but also to the memory of Angus Campbell MacIntyre, who seems to symbolize our human relationship with this great and imperturbable ocean. So thank you very much indeed. And I'd be happy if there is any questions about anything to the young lady there.
Where did you find the sea kelp?
The sea kelp, well, there's heaps of it, but there's a big band off Tristan. It's about 1 mile off Tristan. It almost entirely circles I've been there in a yacht on a previous occasion, and then you tie up because it's got very, very thick branches, and it acts almost like an anchor. So there's lots of it, and indeed the Falkland Islands, as you may well know, the Argentines call Falkland Islanders kelpers because kelp is so important to their lives as seamen, because for a start it's always fouling the propellers of their fishing boats. But do you have a particular interest in kelp?
Yes, I understand that there's depletion of kelp in the ocean.
Golly, well, I should have written about that, because I regard kelp as an infernal nuisance. So I'm all for it being depleted, but no, I don't mean to be facetious. There's a lot of it about in the South Atlantic.
Another question, yes, right there.
How about the lady, yes?
Okay. What provision was made for water for the land?
Oh, rainwater, I mean, that adheres to the grass. I mean, believe you me, other people say, how do they sleep? I mean, there are technical problems, I agree, but they survive, and they're still there. And I assure you, if you find this story a little bit hard to stomach, go to the Faroe Islands. They drink, they do without sleep, I'm not sure, and they grow to prodigious sizes. So,
Maybe one more? Somewhere,
Yeah.
right there.
Yes, it was reported that yesterday there was a 3.9 earthquake in West Hampton, in Long Island. And I was wondering, when I had visited a number of years ago the Western Observatory, it was reported that during World War II, they used seismology to detect these hurricanes, the titanic storms. Have you, in your research, come across any things about the use of seismology and
golly, to detect storms, I find that a little bit difficult to understand why. I mean, seismic events like tsunamis, of course, I mean, we all know about the Sumatran tsunami that was preceded by an enormous seismic shock, but storms, I've not heard that, no. It perplexes me.
A very big storm that would fluctuate in the Atlantic that would, with convoys going across, be detected because...
I don't think, I've never heard that. I mean, they would, however big the storm, it would have a pretty minimal seismic fingerprint, I would have thought, on the on the subsurface of the ocean, I would swallow that story with a large teaspoonful of salt if I did.
Simon, many thanks. The book has got half the entertaining anecdotes and passion that you have here tonight. It's something we'll all want to have. And I will say that Simon Winchester will be out to sign copies with the table from the rare books that are out front here in just a moment. And my last message, as usual, we're certainly glad to have you all here tonight. These programs are brought to you in part by members of the Aldo Leopold Society and donors to the Carey Institute. We'd certainly love to add your name to the list. Look for us in January when our own scientist, Peter Groffman, will talk about something related to snow is good. We hope that the evening in January will reinforce that topic. But we'll look for you in the new year on a Friday night, as most of these programs are found. Tonight was an exception, and we're certainly glad to have had you here tonight. Thanks again.